There is no doubt that Victoria was incredibly self-centred. The world revolved around Victoria, which in a way, of course, it did.
For those in power, or vying for it, there can be no rest. Over centuries, kings and queens are crowned, overthrown, imprisoned, reinstated, and murdered.
She's a domineering character, and of course she's a queen, in a world where women are supposed to be quite submissive.
This is a dangerous game of strategy, cunning, and deception. Dynasties will rise and fall, all in answer to the ever-present question that fueled civil war and blood feuds. Which pitted brother against brother, cousin against cousin, father against son. Who will wear the bloody crown of England?
It felt to people in Britain as though the Queen had just vanished. She had abandoned the nation. If the Queen won't fulfil her role, what is the point of having a monarch?
This is the Game of Crowns. It's 1817. King George IV's only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte of Wales, goes into labour. The country prays for their beloved princess and future queen. But their prayers go unanswered. The princess dies, along with her infant son. Her death triggers a succession crisis. Up until now, King George IV's younger brothers have been off gallivanting, racking up severe debts, fathering illegitimate children and spending extortionate amounts of money. They've been too embroiled with their frivolous lifestyles and various mistresses to pay any attention to contracting legitimate royal marriages and siring legitimate heirs. Following the death of Princess Charlotte, the heir to the throne, the succession of the Hanoverian line hangs in the balance.
Princess Charlotte's death meant that George III didn't have any legitimate grandchildren because most of his by then middle-aged sons hadn't bothered to get married. They lived with their mistresses and their families of illegitimate children, while George had been against the marriages of his daughters.
Parliament decides to bribe George's middle-aged brothers, offering them a financial incentive if they would leave their mistresses and make legal royal marriages. They all scramble to make the good marriages they had thus far shucked off in a desperate bid to sire legitimate children who would inherit the great power and greater burden of the crown.
With Charlotte's death, there was a rush of royal marriages amongst her middle-aged uncles. They were all trying to father the next heir to the throne. And they were also hopeful that they might have a reign themselves because George IV was not very healthy, grossly overweight.
The fourth son of George III, Edward, the Duke of Kent and Strathern, marries Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Her brother Leopold was Princess Charlotte's widower and later the first King of Belgium. The newly married Duke and Duchess live in Germany for the first year of their marriage. Soon the princess realizes she is pregnant, but it is a race against time. For the child to be considered legitimate, they must be born in England. The couple race back to England on stormy seas, and at Kensington Palace in 1819, a child is born. Edward wished to name his daughter Charlotte, after the beloved Princess Charlotte who died in childbirth, or Georgiana, named for the many King Georges of the Hanoverian line. But the Prince Regent refused to let his brother give her a royal name. The child is therefore christened Alexandrina Victoria. At birth, Victoria was fifth in the line of succession after the four eldest sons of George III, the Prince Regent, later George IV, Frederick, Duke of York, William, Duke of Clarence, later William IV, and Victoria's father, Edward, Duke of Kent. According to the law of succession, the crown would be passed down the line of brothers until one had a legitimate child. As none of Edward's brothers had produced any legitimate children, it was very likely that Alexandrina Victoria would become monarch. Edward dotes on his daughter and boasts frequently about her to his peers.
Before she was 1 year old, her father, who had been very, very fond of his baby daughter, died, leaving Victoria fatherless. She was, to all intents and purposes, an only child. Her mother was a widow, but her older children were much, much older than Victoria. And Victoria also wasn't able to mix freely with other children.
George IV dies in 1830, after only 10 years on the throne. Frederick, Duke of York, had died a few years earlier, so the third eldest brother, William, Duke of Clarence, becomes King William IV. The infant Victoria is now second in line to the throne.
William IV was well into middle age when he became king. He succeeded his brother, George IV, and he's the third son of George III. He had been hopeful of his succession to the throne ever since the death of his niece, Princess Charlotte, in childbirth, which meant that it became clear that one of George III's other sons was likely to succeed and likely to be the founder of a new line of monarchs.
The widowed Duchess and her daughter stay living in Kensington Palace throughout Victoria's childhood. But the princess's childhood is far from idyllic.
Queen Victoria, although she was born a princess and a likely successor to the throne, had a very sad and, as she described it, melancholy childhood.
Her mother is extremely protective of her daughter and keeps her isolated from children her age, as well as from her father's family.
Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, very much fell under the influence of Sir John Conroy, who had been an equerry to the Duke of Kent and very much guided the household. He was in charge of Victoria's childhood household. The Duchess of Kent adored him. There were rumours that they were lovers, probably unfounded, but certainly she had a very intense and dependent relationship with Conroy.
Her childhood was governed largely by a strict set of rules and protocols known as the Kensington system, devised by the Duchess and her ambitious comptroller to monitor and control the princess.
As a child, Sir John Conroy and the Duchess of Kent sought to control Victoria and to mould her into a future queen. As part of that, they isolated her, they kept her away from the royal court. They also took her on progresses to show her to the people as a future queen, something that angered the King William IV because it attracted attention from him and also of course reminded him of his own death, because of course Victoria would only become queen after he had died. The Kensington system was incredibly strict. It's named after Kensington Palace, where Victoria lived with her mother, and it was intended to ensure that she was never alone. If she wanted to walk downstairs, she had to hold somebody's hand. She slept with her mother. She was watched constantly, largely by people who were favourable to Sir John Conroy and reporting back on her. She was given a very strict education system and had to in fact rate her own behaviour. She had a behaviour book where she would write how she had behaved on that particular day. It's very interesting, often it simply says naughty or very, very naughty. One occasion she writes very, very horribly naughty, which suggests it had not been a good day.
Their goal is to infantilize Victoria so that she would remain a pliant, dependent and easily manipulated young woman, so that when she became queen she would follow their orders, granting them the real power behind the crown. Victoria is always under surveillance and is even forced to sleep in the same room with her mother throughout her childhood.
But it's a very strict, very cloying system, and one that didn't have the desired effect, because rather than creating a childlike, dependent queen, it actually created a woman who was determined to be independent.
William vows to live until Victoria is 18. Thus avoiding a regency which would have placed the Duchess and Conroy in power. True to his word, William waits anxiously until Victoria turns 18, and then a few short weeks later, King William IV dies, leaving the throne to his niece, young Queen Victoria. The 18-year-old Victoria is immediately proclaimed queen, and preparations are made for her coronation.
Victoria's relationship with her mother changed as soon as she became queen. The tables very much turned. The Duchess of Kent was no longer the mistress of the household. Victoria, the Queen, was. And one of her first actions as Queen was to order her bed to be removed from her mother's chamber. After that, she slept alone.
She becomes the first monarch to occupy the newly finished Buckingham Palace, which is the main home of the English monarch today.
As an unmarried queen, a teenager, Victoria still needed a chaperone. She couldn't decently leave her mother behind. It certainly would have set tongues wagging. So when she moved to Buckingham Palace, she was forced to take her mother with her, but she kept her isolated from her. The Duchess of Kent was given a suite of rooms as far from Victoria's as possible, and in fact she even needed to make an appointment to see her own daughter. And in fact Victoria would sometimes send a message back just saying busy.
Victoria is crowned Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland on Thursday, 28th of June 1838.
Victoria's coronation was intended to be a glorious state occasion. She was very, very nervous and in fact recorded in her journal that she'd been woken up by a gun salute to her. She then readied herself for her coronation, and I mean it must have been an absolute spectacle as she set out from Buckingham Palace. The crowds were enormous and cheering. You know, she was very, very popular when she first came to the throne. People had actually climbed trees so that they could get a better look at her. The elderly Lord Rolle tripped and fell, rolling all the way down the steps. But Victoria really won approval when instead of just sitting there and waiting for him to pick herself up, she actually got up from her seat and walked down so that he could kiss her hand without having to attempt the stairs again. It was an overwhelming occasion, but she acquitted herself incredibly well. Queen Victoria was of course very young when she became queen. She just turned 18, so she had only just stopped needing a regent and was able to rule as an adult. As a teenage queen, her first emotion was one of freedom. She was pleased to rid herself of her mother and of Sir John Conroy, and she very much set out to enjoy herself as queen. The first year or so of her reign, she was out dancing into the night. She enjoyed herself immensely. She certainly was in no rush to get married. But she also found the task of governing quite daunting, because she'd gone from being effectively a schoolgirl, kept closeted away. She had barely been to the royal court, to suddenly being the monarch, being the Queen of Britain. She had to see her ministers. She had to attend the Privy Council. It was a huge learning curve for an 18-year-old. She certainly felt unprepared. She certainly felt nervous. Lord Melbourne was Victoria's first Prime Minister, and it was expected that she would have almost daily meetings with him, because of course she was the head of state and was expected to play a role in the government.
Victoria is politically inexperienced due to the strict and sheltered upbringing and tuition she received at the hands of her mother and Conroy.
She couldn't remember her own father, and apart from her uncle Leopold, she had very few male figures in her life that she trusted. She certainly didn't trust Sir John Conroy, who had effectively stepped into the role of stepfather to some extent. With Lord Melbourne, Victoria found a father figure, and he also had had a very tragic personal life and had lost his wife and only child, and seems to have felt affectionate, quite fatherly towards her. She saw him as a father figure, she saw him as a mentor. She probably also had a crush on him, and he was quite good looking and quite urbane, very charming. And he moulded her early character as queen. It was Melbourne who showed Victoria how to be the queen. Not always to good effect. He very much taught her to dislike and to be wary of Tories, his political opponents, and this did cause problems. Because of course, as a constitutional monarch, Victoria was supposed to be above party politics. But she was so devoted to Lord Melbourne that she was even prepared to bring down a Tory government if it meant that she got to keep Lord Melbourne with her. Albert would of course become the love of Victoria's life and absolutely the focus of her devotion. He was her first cousin. Her mother and his father were brother and sister, and their mutual uncle Leopold had moulded Albert as a potential consort for Victoria. Although Victoria probably wasn't aware of it, there was always a plan in the family that Albert would marry her and guide her queenship. Albert came from Saxe-Coburg, which was a small German duchy. He had a troubled family life. His father and mother were completely ill-suited. Both took lovers, and his father had then divorced his mother and taken custody of the son, so Albert was banned from seeing his mother. So he'd had a very troubled family life. He first met Victoria when they were both teenagers, before she became queen. He came to her birthday ball. And actually she wasn't that impressed with him. Her journal talks about the arrival of cousin Albert and his brother Ernest, but actually he seems to have been quite a sickly character, not much fun. He actually retired from the ball early because he felt unwell. So he really didn't make much impression on Victoria. Certainly she didn't bother to invite either Albert or his brother to her coronation, although his father was invited. Victoria was not keen to marry. She liked her freedom as a young queen. She liked the fact that suddenly nobody was telling her what to do. When Lord Melbourne actually suggested that she should marry someone, she actually said that was a shocking suggestion.
Now 20, the Queen and Prince Albert have been corresponding for 3 years.
She therefore was quite half-hearted when she invited Albert to visit. But the moment she saw him, all of that changed. In her diary, she records that Albert was beautiful. She was absolutely smitten with him. He was the most attractive man she'd ever seen, and within days, he had absolutely won her heart.
He is a highly educated man and takes a particular interest in the arts, science, trade and industry. They wish to wed, though it is forbidden for one to propose to a reigning monarch. So Victoria, rather unconventionally, must propose to Albert.
As the Queen, it was not thought proper that Albert should propose to her. So she actually had to take the plunge herself, which she found very nerve-wracking. She summoned Albert to come to her. And when he came to her, she sort of very shyly said, shall we get married? And of course he accepted.
The couple marry in 1840. She wears a white dress on her wedding day, starting the trend of a white wedding, which continues to this day. The couple is very much in love. While Victoria is hot-headed and quick to anger, the steady and calm Albert cools her rages and is a great influence on the young Queen. He convinces the Queen to be less partisan in her dealings with Parliament, shaping the role of the constitutional monarchy that England has to this day. Albert gains public support as well as political influence as time passes, and Parliament passes the Regency Act, 1840, to designate him regent in the event of Victoria's death before their child reaches the age of majority.
Victoria and Albert would have a large family. They had 9 children.
He rules as regent while the Queen is rendered incapacitated as she suffers through her many pregnancies.
Prince Albert was the more hands-on father, but Victoria certainly involved herself in raising her children and did build very strong relationships with them, particularly in adulthood. The one exception to that really is her son, her eldest son, Bertie, who will later become Edward VII. And there she had a very troubled relationship. She was highly critical of Bertie. She considered him to be very unattractive. She said he had no chin and he had unpleasant bulbous eyes. And actually when we look at pictures of Victoria and Bertie, they look very, very similar. The traits she was criticising were traits that came from her and her side of the family. She was worried about his morality. She was worried that he wasn't as clever as his father. And the fact that Bertie was never able to live up to Victoria's ideal of Albert cast a shadow over their relationship for the rest of their lives.
On the 10th of July, 1840, the Queen and Albert are riding in their carriage in a parade at Hyde Park. The crowd is cheering and happy to meet their new Queen, when all of a sudden, Edward Oxford, an unemployed 18-year-old, fires a dueling pistol at the Queen, who is 5 months pregnant at the time. The bullet misses, and Oxford is wrestled to the ground by the crowd. The motive for this assassination attempt is unclear. Queen Victoria will survive a further 7 assassination attempts throughout her reign. In 1845, Ireland is hit by a potato blight. Crops fail, and over the next 4 years, over 1 million Irish people die of hunger, and another 1 million emigrate to the United States, in what became known as the Great Famine. Victoria is named the Famine Queen by those in Ireland, but donates £2,000 of her own money to the relief effort. Following the arrival of news of a revolution in Paris, Chartist activity increased, and marches, riots and protests broke out across Britain and Ireland. The civil unrest in France led to the collapse of the French monarchy, which caused much concern for the young queen. Amid growing concerns over the Chartist movement, a working-class movement for political reform, and the republican sentiments the group harboured, in 1848 the Queen and Albert flee to the Isle of Wight. They come out of hiding a few months later when tensions dissipate and the Chartist movement declines. In 1857 there was a rebellion in India, with a major uprising against the rule of the British East India Company, which for centuries had ruled as sovereign power on behalf of the British Crown. The rebellion led to the dissolution of the East India Company, and the colony is now under direct rule by the British government. Queen Victoria will formally become Empress of India in 1877. Enraged by rumours that their eldest son is having an affair with an actress, Albert travels to Cambridge to confront him. Upon return, he falls unwell. His doctors believe that he is suffering from typhoid fever in 1861. The Queen and many of their children sit with him as he dies. Victoria is devastated and blames her son for her husband's death.
With Albert's death, Victoria was absolutely stunned. It was reported that at the moment he died, she just screamed. She was so shocked by his death. She was, of course, only in her early 40s. She had spent years being undermined by Albert, who wanted to take on the role of sovereign. And so she felt entirely lost, entirely at sea by Albert's death. She immediately retreated into mourning black, and she would never leave mourning. She wears black for the rest of her reign. And when we think about Queen Victoria, we think about this black-clad widow with her white widow's cap. She refused to fulfill her public duties as sovereign. She simply felt unable to go out in public with the death of Prince Albert.
Heartbroken and grief-stricken, Victoria withdraws from public life. She will stay in mourning for the rest of her long life, wearing only black, and is labelled the Widow of Windsor. Her self-imposed seclusion leads to a sharp decline in the popularity of the monarchy. The public is frustrated with the fact that the Queen isn't fulfilling her royal or official governmental duties, which encourages the growth of the Republican movement.
And in the decade after his death, this caused real problems because it felt to people in Britain as though the Queen had just vanished. She had abandoned the nation. And there was a real growing rise in Republican sentiment. People were basically saying, you know, if the Queen won't fulfill her role, what is the point of having a monarch? So it was a very difficult time for the monarchy.
Her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, writes hastily to her to encourage her to appear in public, and the Queen reluctantly agrees. But her popularity continues to fall. In the early 1870s, news arrives of the establishment of the Third Republic in France. Inspired by this and fed by the Queen's continued seclusion, republicanism in the United Kingdom grows to its strongest. The Queen is in danger. Radical MPs speak out against her governance in Parliament, and a large Republican rally in Trafalgar Square demanded Victoria's removal. As well as this, the Prince of Wales falls ill with typhoid fever, the same illness that killed his father, and there are doubts over whether he will survive. The 10th anniversary of her husband's death approaches, and the prince is still gravely ill. The succession and security of both Victoria's family and the monarchy rely on her son. Miraculously, he recovers, and in 1872, mother and son attend a public parade through London and a grand service of thanksgiving in St. Paul's Cathedral, and Republican sentiment subsides.
And it was really only as Victoria started to emerge, and as she emerged as the elder queen with her jubilees, because of course she has her golden and her diamond jubilees, her popularity returns. But it was a very difficult period for many years after Prince Albert's death. When we think about Queen Victoria, we tend to think about Victorian Albert, and we think about Albert as the great love of her life. There's one man in particular who very much filled the void that Albert left, and that is her Highland servant, John Brown.
She befriends a Scotsman called John Brown, a gillie who'd worked for Prince Albert.
Victoria met John Brown at Balmoral, which was her Scottish residence and one of her favourite places. She loved to retreat there. She could be more herself there. She didn't have to be monarch. She didn't have to stand on ceremony. But after Albert's death, she became increasingly close to him. Very much so, to the extent that they were rumoured to be lovers, and that there were even rumours of a secret marriage between them. It's very difficult to get to the bottom of the relationship between Victoria and John Brown, because so many of her papers were altered or even destroyed after her death by her children. We know that Princess Beatrice, her daughter, removed many references to John Brown from Victoria's journals, while her son Edward VII ordered letters to be destroyed that related to John Brown.
In the years following the death of her husband, he serves as the Queen's personal attendant and becomes a favourite of hers, earning her the nickname Mrs. Brown.
It was John Brown who Victoria relied upon. She was incredibly close to him, a very, very close relationship. Her children despised him. Partly they despised him because of his low rank, but also the fact that he was so close to the Queen. John Brown was as devoted to Victoria as she was to him, and he certainly helped bring her out of the darkest period of her mourning.
For the next 3 decades, Victoria reigns as sovereign over an ever-growing empire.
There is no doubt that Victoria was incredibly self-centred. The world revolved around Victoria, which in a way, of course, it did.
This was a period of expansion for the British, and by the end of her reign it is said that she ruled over an empire upon which the sun never set.
And that was largely true. If you look at maps of the world in Victoria's reign, large parts of it are coloured to show the British Empire.
From Canada to Australia, New Zealand to India, Queen Victoria ruled as sovereign.
The 19th century is one of those centuries of enormous change. Britain in 1800 was a hugely different place to Britain in 1900.
The Victorian era has become one of the most famous and celebrated in history. A period of significant social, economic and technological progress in the United Kingdom.
Britain had undergone the Industrial Revolution, so it had gone from a still largely farming economy to one that was manufacturing on an enormous scale. Cities had grown enormously, particularly big industrial centres.
Celebrated for its countless inventions, including the telephone, phonograph, flushing toilets, and the electric light bulb.
It was a time of great innovation. It was a time of great learning. You know, this is where we have Charles Darwin. We have some great Victorian novelists. We have Charles Dickens, we have William Thackeray.
But where there is light, there is also darkness, and Victorian London is squalid. The crime and poverty inspired novels such as Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist and Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Jack the Ripper, an infamous serial killer who murdered several women, roams the narrow streets of London.
Mortality rates were very, very high, particularly among children. Death and disease was rife again in the cities. So it was a period of huge change, but it was also a period of hardship, of difficulty. Although there were social changes made in the period, for example, it became compulsory for children to attend school. Checks were put on child labour, for example. Women's rights increased to some extent in the Victorian period, particularly in relation to the custody of children and the ownership of their own property. But in general, if you were poor, it was a hard time to live throughout the 19th century. We know such a lot about Queen Victoria because she very diligently kept a journal right up from her childhood until just before her death. And although it was quite heavily edited by her daughter Beatrice, it's a really great way of seeing inside her head, seeing what motivated her, what she thought, and also of course her correspondence and records that other people kept of Victoria. She struggles very much with empathy. She struggles to understand that other people may have feelings too, because actually the centre of everything is Victoria. However, she was also very, very kind, and we see in her journal her worrying about individuals that she'd met, and worrying that they had enough money, and worrying about charity. She also worries very much about her family, and she sends a lot of advice, and it could be quite cloying, but it's clear that she's devoted to them and that she loves them. And she also loves her people, and we can see that. She tried very hard to be a good monarch. When she became queen, she said, "I will be good," and she tried very hard to live up to that throughout her reign. She's a domineering character, and of course she's a queen in a world where women are supposed to be quite submissive. But she was quite a modern woman in many respects. She's a fascinating, complicated character, but at her heart, I think it's very difficult to remove the queen from the woman, because actually her queenship was just so central to her identity and who she became.
On 23rd of September 1896, Victoria surpasses her grandfather George III as the longest reigning monarch in British history. She celebrates her Diamond Jubilee a year later, and the country erupts into the festive spirit to celebrate the long 60-year reign of their queen. But it is clear that the Queen is ailing. An open-air service of thanksgiving to celebrate her Jubilee is held outside St. Paul's Cathedral so that the 78-year-old Queen does not have to climb the steps. She sits in her carriage while the ceremony is observed. By the turn of the century, rheumatism in her legs has rendered her disabled and her eyesight clouded by cataracts. She spends one last Christmas at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight before dying at the age of 81, with her eldest son and successor, Edward, at her side. He is immediately proclaimed King Edward VII of England, and a new era begins for the English monarchy. From her 9 children, she has 42 grandchildren. Such was Victoria's influence on the world's monarchies that the current royal families of Spain, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and the United Kingdom can claim to be descendants of the Queen.
throughout the period, when we think about the 19th century, who we really think about is one central figure, and that is, of course, the woman who gave her name to the age, Queen Victoria.
The Victorian era was a period of constant and ever-quickening change and a turning point for the country. It is upon the foundations that Victoria laid that Britain's modern monarchy is built.